Good evening. For those who don't know, I'm Jonathan Michie. I'm president of Kellogg College, so welcome to the college. We've got a special category of fellows for non-academics to extend our reach and our impact as a college. They're called Bynum Tudor Fellows, after the late Bynum Tudor, who was a great friend and supporter of the college. Past members of that fellowship have included Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who was absolutely fantastic, really engaged with the students and other members of the college when he was here. Also includes Ban Ki-moon, who, as you know, is very successful Secretary General of the United Nations for 10 years, and now King Charles III, Prince Charles, as he was when we first made him a fellow. In fact, it was in this very place just before the first lockdown that he returned, having made a royal visit a couple of years previously, to accept his fellowship and say what an honour it was to be made a fellow of this college. So no pressure there, but just saying that's what the king said. I'm not going to introduce Mishal Husain, because that's the purpose of the In Conversation, and Mishal is much better placed than me to introduce herself. But I will say that there's no one better placed to be a member of our Bynum Tudor Fellowship. She has been a journalist all her life, for more than 20 years now at the BBC, before just recently going back to Bloomberg. And her work has always embedded the principles of this college, of pursuing truth and using that for social good. The In Conversation is going to be conducted by Professor Yasmin Khan, who is the Vice-President of the college. So I'll hand over to Yasmin. Thank you.
Well, Mishal, welcome, and it's wonderful to see you here. I know you've had a long-standing interest in South Asian history, which people might not know from the other aspects of your work, presenting television documentary programs about Gandhi and about the Second World War. And last year you published Broken Threads, which is this fantastic book, My Family from Empire to Independence, which is what our conversation will be about today, mostly. It's a really beautiful book, it's compelling, and it sets the story of Mishal's immediate family, especially your 4 grandparents, against the backdrop of the final days of the British Raj in India in the 19th and 20th century, especially with a focus on the war and the partition in 1947, which is very topical today, of course, sadly. And it says you set out to set individual lives against the backdrop of their times. So why write this book? Because there's so many things that you know about and that you do and that you could write about. Why write this?
Yasmin, thank you very much, and thank you, Jonathan, as well. And I would like to say that I'm genuinely, not just because I was led to say this by the King's example, I am really delighted and honoured to be a Bynum Tudor Fellow. And I think Kellogg is a very special place, not only a beautiful place, and we're here on an absolutely gorgeous afternoon, but also because of its spirit and the way it is so international and people at different stages of their lives. And it's a community I feel really involved in. I don't know if the Bynum Tudor Fellows invite each other to things, but if they do, then I'm definitely available for my fellow, any invitation from His Majesty from one Bynum Tudor Fellow to another. I only hope I don't have to reciprocate. So I'm really honoured to be here. And Yasmin, I also do want to say something about you, because you are the reason I'm here. And when I decided I wanted to write the story of my family, I had to read, I knew bits of what had happened to them in this seismic period in the middle of the 20th century, but I knew I needed to fill in the gaps and read so much more widely. And 2 of Yasmin's books, The Raj at War and your book directly on 1947 and partition, were so important to my understanding, because Yasmin writes in this way that goes beyond academia. No offense, I know there are many other academics here, but I mean, it's accessible, it's reaching, it's both scholarly and accessible. And so I learned from your work, and that's how we came to know each other, and that's my link to Kellogg ahead of today. So I To answer your question, which I promise I was getting to the answer, I know what it's like when people don't answer your questions. I realised that I had travelled the world and reported on stories all over the world, and indeed reported on South Asia, Indian elections, Pakistani elections, anniversaries of independence, terror attacks, all kinds of circumstances. And yet, and it was as if the story of my own family was in the background somewhere. And finally, about 4 years ago, I thought, I want to bring this story from the back of my mind to the front of my mind. And yet, I still want to retain something of my journalist's eye. So I know this is going to be a story close to my heart, but I also want it to be factual, and I want it to be evidenced. And the lens with which I approach my professional life is an intrinsic part of me. So I thought, I can't distance what I do for a living completely from this story. And so I put my 4 grandparents as characters in this story, but in many ways I think I was treating them as people, as if I was interviewing them. I mean, none of them are here anymore, but I was interrogating what they said and what they wrote down and the things I remembered from memory and some of the actual things I had on record. And I fact-checked them in the archives, and I compared what they said to what others said and what people from other communities said about the same period in time. So I think that what Broken Threads ended up being is a combination of my professional life and who I am as a person. And so while it's a family story, I think it did end up being much more historical and much more political than I imagined at the start, because I thought, yes, I'm writing about people, but we are all the products of our times. We are all influenced, our decisions and our thinking of the world is influenced not just by our immediate everyday lives, but by the news. So I felt like I needed to understand the news and current affairs of my grandparents' time to understand them.
Well, I think all of that really shows in the book. It's forensically researched, very, very careful, and the commitment to truth is really there. And I think journalists can make exceptionally good historians, as this book shows. So thank you for your comments about my work, but I really feel that this actually has the best of both, in the sense it has that storytelling, but also that historical canvas. Tell us about the research, because you found all sorts of things along the way when you were writing.
Yes, so my 4 grandparents are Shahid and Tahira, my mother's parents, and Mumtaz and Mary, my father's parents. And as you can tell from my grandmother Mary's name, hers is a bit different to the other 3 names. And so on my father's side, my grandfather was a Muslim, and his wife, my grandmother, was an Anglo-Indian Catholic from the southeast of India. And her ancestry is the subject of a current Who Do You Think You Are, which some of you might have seen. And bizarrely, just tonight, I've met Charlie, who worked on the research for that program. Where are you, Charlie? Yeah, which is, we've just met. He's someone who worked on the very early stages of research, and I knew his name because he was talking to members of my family, but it was all a secret from me, so we've met for the first time tonight. So Mumtaz and Mary, and then Shahid and Tara, my mother's parents. And I knew that, so I started with what they wrote and said about their times. And I was lucky that Shahid had written published work of different kinds, military history, his diary between 1946 and 1947, when he worked for Field Marshal Auchinleck, who was the Commander-in-Chief of the Indian Army, and after Mountbatten, the second most important person in British India, the second most important British official in India at the time. And so I had published work of his. My grandfather Mumtaz left an extraordinary unpublished memoir, which I'm sorry to say that at the time he was writing it, all of us in the family thought this was a sort of old age hobby, something to keep him busy. And thankfully, one of my uncles saved it from his computer when he died. And I am embarrassed saying this because this was how we all thought of it. And it is the most extraordinary resource where he details what people are eating and what they're cooking and how they dress, including how his mother observes parda, which if I'd thought about it, I would have guessed, because this is a conservative middle-class Muslim family in the south of Punjab, but I'd never really thought about actually what it meant to her everyday life. And he describes it, exactly how it affected her everyday life. And so I had this incredible resource. And then my grandmother, Tahira, was a very wise person, and there was the odd fragment of written word that she'd left behind, but my mother had actually recorded her talking, so we found these tapes. And then my grandmother Mary, and Thyra and Mary are actually the two women on the cover there. Thyra on her wedding day, and Mary probably not long after her wedding day. And as far as Mary's concerned, I'm very fortunate to still have a living sibling, my great aunt Anne, who's 101, and whose memory is now fading. But when I started talking to her for this book, it was very much all there. And she said, I'll tell you whatever you want to know, my darling. And I sat with her, and of course, it was absolutely extraordinary because she told me about the events of their early life, and it was really a window into another world. So I definitely had to work harder on the women's stories. Women, and I remember my grandmother Thyra saying this, I could write a book, but I'm not like your grandfather. He could disappear off and do this writing. This house would come to a standstill if I did that. And she was, it was ever thus from Virginia Woolf and so many others. So, but I did have these resources, but some people who've read the book in the last year say to me, oh, you were very lucky you had these resources. But it didn't feel that way when I set out. And that's why I would say to anyone who wants to do something similar, when you start, you will find more and more threads and you will be able to follow them. And there will be always things that you wish you knew. But in the end, I had to stop following some threads because there was too much, not necessarily individually, but more and more fragments of history that I wanted to bring into it.
And I wonder if there's a tension between writing about people you love and that you're close to, and then the kind of frankness with which you approach some of their stories, because you're seeing it, as you said, as a journalist as well as a member of the family. And I wondered if I think you're respectfully honest.
Yes, I definitely worried about that at the time. I thought, well, how can I be how can I be objective about them? And I hope I found the zone where I am searching for other narratives. It's not only their story. I've worked really hard so that this book can be read by, obviously most of my family are Muslim, and primarily but not exclusively, I'm writing the story of a mainly Muslim family. But I've been really, deeply moved that it's been well received in India as well as in Pakistan, even though there's some quite difficult things about it in terms of individual perspectives of history of those two countries. And of course, I hope that in this current climate, people who want to understand how the Kashmir dispute began, well, they will find it in these pages. And I have to say that I was apprehensive about writing anything about Kashmir at the beginning because it is so complex and so contentious. But I really agonized over the sequence of events in the autumn of 1947 and trying to understand it. And ultimately, I think it hopefully is useful for people who are either connected through their heritage or who are just curious, because the events of that time still are, as we're demonstrably seeing today, are still part of the story.
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's so topical today to be talking about this, and I wondered about that because one of the things that comes across is how in 1946 or 1947, how contingent the creation of Pakistan is, and how uncertain the fact that this new country that your grandparents end up moving to and supporting seems. It's not a foregone conclusion by any extent.
No, in 1946, you see, it's so interesting this we are speaking just shortly after the 80th anniversary of VE Day, and of course very soon after that, there was a general election here. Labour came to power. Clement Attlee became the Prime Minister. And very soon, because part of the manifesto was the independence of India, very soon Attlee put a team together to work out what self-government for India could look like. And so I detail this because two of my grandparents, Shahid and Thyra, were living in Delhi, close to the circle of power, if you like, and they were seeing the cabinet mission, the three wise men, as they call them, arrive from London, and everyone's incredibly curious to know what they're going to decide. What is the formula for government? And no one's talking about a partition at that stage. There is talk of a separate Muslim homeland, but no one's really quite clear what that might mean. Is it more an idea? Is it a pseudonym for minority rights? Is it a sort of loose collection of provinces that are going to work together? So all of these things are up in the air. And And then, of course, as things develop, and then Mountbatten became the viceroy early in 1947, things moved very, very quickly. And because, as you'll all know, I've spent a lot of my time questioning British politicians and powerful people about the exercise of power, that's why I think it became an increasingly political book, because part of me was thinking, how was it that someone like Mountbatten, with so little knowledge of India, let alone experience, in this incredibly complex country with all its ethnicities and its communities and its faiths and its huge terrain and geography, how did someone with so little knowledge and experience get tasked with this incredibly important job? And my grandfather Shahid wrote in his diary, after seeing Mountbatten arrive in Delhi in early 1947, said, to my mind, his whole career is built around the fact that he's a member of the royal family. And I thought, this does not reflect well, really. Like, this is an important job that is part of British foreign policy. Mountbatten was clearly a very charming individual, and he was chosen for his personal skills, but his career had been enhanced by the fact that he was a cousin of the king, and that shouldn't have been a prerequisite for the job even then at all.
Yeah, I think there's a whole chapter on Mountbatten, and you're pretty critical, as you are being now, of Mountbatten, which is a perennial question in the history of this subject. How far was he responsible? But there's a quote where you say, where Mountbatten was questioned, and he said, "Once partition is accepted in principle, I shall issue orders to see that there are no communal disturbances anywhere in the country. If there should be the slightest agitation, I shall adopt measures to nip the trouble in the bud." And that's in 1947, at the beginning of the year. And as we know, by the end of the year, 14 million people have been displaced, and there's all these deaths. So it sounds as if you weighing it up. Is that what you mean by the fact the book is political?
Yes, but I would say that Clement Attlee himself is a really important figure in all of this. He'd been part of a commission to India not long after the First World War, which was really, I think, the missed opportunity of British foreign policy, really after the First World War, and the immense contribution of men to the war effort. After that, there should have been a real concerted effort to make India a self-governing dominion, as Canada and Australia and South Africa and New Zealand already were. And of course, that was a different model of settlers, but really, I think that's the missed opportunity, because had there been a real effort to think, right, it's time for India to be a self-governing dominion, then there would have had to be a form of government found that did find a way through the complex, the nature of the population, the fact that the population was about 70% Hindu, and then about 20%, you'll know better than me, Yasmin, but of course many other faiths beyond Hindus and Muslims. So I think that was a missed opportunity. And I think for journalism, it was a more deferential age. There's more than one account, especially when it got to 1947, and even afterwards through the Kashmir dispute, where there are journalists, British journalists, who are stopping themselves writing things because they're very conscious, and they're being told, if you write this, India and Pakistan will go to all-out war. And they are very mindful of duty and responsibility, but are very shocked by what they're seeing. So I do think that Attlee's focus was at home, the National Health Service, the welfare state. We can all understand why that's really important. But I think the haste, and of course the haste and the attitude was there in many ways in Palestine as well. A year later, you can see a similar attitude in the decision to depart, which was the common thing. In 1947, Attlee decided, and this was the statement issued in Parliament, that Britain would leave India and power would pass into responsible Indian hands 15 months later. Actually, it happened much earlier than that. But imagine a policy like that coming out. Of course, everyone was thinking, well, what does this mean, responsible Indian hands? And where is the incentive for people to compromise with each other when essentially the colonial power has said, we're leaving anyway? And with our modern day eyes, the comparison I kept thinking of is, look at Northern Ireland, look at the immense effort, but obviously it's decades down the line, but look at that kind of effort on finding something that communities can feel vested in, all kinds of safeguards. It's not perfect, it's tested, we can see that. Outside elements are guaranteeing it and have also vested in it. And that's I think, if only that kind of will and spirit and model had been there 80 years ago.
But on the other hand, there is that pull towards Pakistan and the creation of Pakistan. And another theme that comes out in the book is how impressed your grandparents meet Qaid-e-Azam or Jinnah, the leader of Pakistan, directly, and are sort of taken by him and by the idea of Pakistan.
Absolutely, but then the idea of Pakistan is a really important word in that, because it's to some people, and it meant different things to different people. And Yasmin's work, I absolutely recommend you because she's the expert on this. But it did mean different things to different people. At one point, my grandfather Mumtaz, who in the sort of towards the end of 1946 is living in what was then Cochin, now Kochi, in the very south of India. So hardly any Muslims there. And in a local mosque, he hears the few Muslims in Cochin shouting Pakistan Zindabad. And he asked one of them, he said, "What on earth are you shouting this long live Pakistan for? You're surely you're not going to move to another part of India if it becomes a Muslim homeland." And essentially this man says to him, well, it's a symbol for us. It's what it meant to him was sort of like, I want my rights as a Muslim, a minority, part of a minority community in India, to be respected and to be protected in some way. And that's what it meant to him. But Jinnah himself, who is little known in this country and horribly portrayed in Richard Attenborough's Gandhi film, is a very I think someone who is really worth everyone knowing more about, because there are not very many men in the 20th century who were the fathers of new nations, and he was absolutely that. And sadly, he lived for barely a year after the founding of Pakistan, so he wasn't around for long. But he was the most successful lawyer in British India in the early 20th century, when essentially his political coming of age was in London, when he studied at Lincoln's Inn, and he used to go and watch speeches in the House of Commons, and he had a reader's ticket to the British Library, and he absorbed all of the ideals of the time. And it was a time when nationalism was replacing the ideology of empire, and that's what men of his generation took on board. Not nationalism as we think of it today, but the sense of the nation state replacing the world of the empire. So he was and I think to my grandparents, Shahid and Taira, he was a symbol of a progressive Muslim middle class. His sister was educated, was a professional. She was not in Parda. His wife was not in Parda. His wife was not a Muslim. She was from another community, of the Parsi community. So I think he really did represent something, progress, social mobility, someone who was a role model. So I think the idea of, again, we use these terms Muslim leader. What does it mean? It doesn't necessarily mean religious leader. It can and does have a much broader meaning than that.
And you bring that out in the book in the sense of the very first days of the creation of the new state. He goes to Anglican Cathedral to give thanks for the creation of Pakistan, and he also appoints Hindu to the first cabinet. So there's a sense of that poignancy, I think, of the alternative ways that the state could have developed.
Yes, the first Sunday after independence, he went to church in Karachi. And that was obviously very important to the Christian community, but an important symbol to everyone else as well. And he certainly did not envisage the exodus of Hindus and Sikhs from Punjab and Sindh and elsewhere, actually, the northwest frontier province as well. He did not envisage that. He did not want it. It happened because of communal disturbances and the deterioration of law and order. So that was a very sad thing. And actually, there's a wonderful speech of his which I have put in Broken Threads around the chapter on independence, and it's where he speaks in exactly that period in August 1947, and he says the model that he cites is England. The model that he cites is England centuries ago, and he says just like Protestants and Catholics. Just like just like Protestants and Catholics, there were times when they were ready to kill each other or were killing each other in England. Those differences have changed over time. And that's what I think that our communities, meaning primarily Hindus and Muslims, over time, that's what will be. The edges of our differences will fade away. And the most important thing is our citizenship.
And towards the end of the book, you move to the contemporary and say you're conscious of what would have caused your grandparents pain today, which is a really touching phrase. And I think it's in relation to how the contemporary situation has panned out. And I think we've both been lucky enough to go to India and Pakistan, but you talk about the difficulties that persist for people in kind of knowing the other side of the border or even understanding what's going on.
Yeah, and I really wanted to capture that because my grandparents were the last, almost the last, to have proper friends on the other side of the border, to have people that they'd studied with and served with in the Second World War, in the case of my two grandfathers. And when I found these I could see the kind of bonds and the way that initially they did try to see each other. They're brother officers, when you've served together, even though you end up in the Indian and Pakistan army, the ones who'd served together thought of themselves as brother officers. And then there are two extraordinary things just in our family alone, which was that in the 1965 war, the son of one of my grandparents' dear friends was shot down and became a prisoner of war in Pakistan in the 1965 war. And my grandmother said, I heard that he'd been shot down. And every instinct in my body said, I wanted to go and see if I could help him because I'd known him as a boy. And then in 1971, one of my uncles was a prisoner of war in India for 2 years after the fall of East Pakistan and the creation of Bangladesh. And in his prisoner of war camp, one day there was a message, and someone came to him and said, Major Jafar, there is a message for you from General Cariappa. And everyone knew who General Cariappa was. He was the first Indian commander-in-chief of the Indian Army after independence. He was retired by then. And the message said, General Cariappa would like to know if you are all right and if there's anything he can do for you. And Jafar put this in a letter back home to Pakistan and said, I had this message. And it was, obviously it meant the world to my grandparents because all of those years later, their friend had not forgotten them and indeed just reached out to their son-in-law in this camp in India. So there are some, there are many beautiful moments recorded. And I think, the current situation. But yes, you're right. Of course, today, most citizens of India and Pakistan just don't know anything about each other. May I just read a little bit, Yasmin, perhaps? Because I think probably the wisest person who emerges from the book is my grandmother Tahira, who was able to articulate in a very sensitive way the story of her time. And I found these tapes, as I said, which my mother thankfully had recorded. Tahira's memory faded in her final years, but her influence is there in the way that I lay a table or look at a garden or tie a sari, although my fingers will never scissor through fabric and flick it to create swift, sharp folds the way hers did. Maybe I'll try and recapture our life, the fabulous, happy life that we had, 5 decades of it, she said on tape after she was widowed, though she shied away from the idea of writing history. Partition was a sad, sad era, she concluded. I will not hesitate to say it here, even though this is not meant to be a political book, but it need not have happened had the majority in India accepted ordinary demands from a minority. But it happened, and the way that it happened was tragic, and to the eternal shame of the people of India and Pakistan, that big tragedy has been followed by others.
Thank you. I'm glad you've moved to Tahira also because women are really important in this book. And I think one of the textures that it has is showing the transformation in Muslim women's lives in particular across the 20th century and the way that the bonds of purdah are loosening and the new freedoms that women are able to take advantage of.
Yes, and some of it does, of course, depend on class. And my grandfather, Tahira, did not come from she came from a middle-class background, but one that was socially mobile in that her father was a doctor. His father had been a tailor, so there's a significant difference in work that took place in that one generation. But she was born in 1920, and she did go away to university as a single woman before she was married, and that would have been unusual at the time. But there are other people in different circumstances in the book. My grandmother Mary, was educated by nuns in Vishakhapatnam in Southeast India, between Kolkata and what was then Madras, now Chennai. And when she lost her father in a tragic accident that my great-aunt Anne told me about firsthand, it was nearly the end of her education, because her widowed mother was, Mariamma, she was born a Hindu, whereas Mary's father was an Irish Catholic. And she was left high and dry, really, when her husband died young. And had it not been for the nuns deferring fees and deciding that they would keep these children in school and that their mother could pay the fees later on when she managed to sell some land, that could have been the end of Mary's education. But in the end, my grandmother Mary travelled 2.5 days on the train in order to go and study as a nurse in Lahore, right on the other side of British India. So it was a huge journey. But again, there was social mobility there and female emancipation, because her mother was not educated. But there are other figures in the book whose lives are very different. And one of them is a cousin of my grandfather, Mumtaz, from his hometown of Multan, who is the woman that he was supposed to marry, because his family, in their very traditional way, wanted him to marry his cousin, and were upset, furious, enraged when they realized that he had got married to Mary. And unfortunately, the word they put out in Multan was that this lady, Mumtaz's cousin Rahima, was actually that a marriage had taken place between her and Mumtaz, which meant that she never married anyone else. So in fact, she was sort of trapped for the rest of her life, never able to have a marriage and a family. So that's a very sad reflection of the constraints of the time. And that kind of expectation of people marrying their cousin is, of course, a fact of probably millions of people in present-day South Asia.
And that story, it is a real love story, it seems, between Mumtaz and Mary. He writes, "She's the anchor and focus of my life." That overcomes all sorts of different barriers. It's not just the religious one. There's all sorts of different hurdles that they have to kind of get past in order to marry.
And they think very hard about how they're going to marry, because both Mumtaz and Mary were people of deep faith. My grandmother Mary, I knew this because it was a well-known tale my grandfather Mumtaz agreed that all his children could be baptized and brought up as Catholics, although of course they made their own choices as they grew up. But my father certainly was baptized, and then he had jaundice as a baby, and she was convinced he was going to die, and she prayed to the Virgin Mary and said, "If you save my son, I will dress him in your colours for 7 years." And sure enough, my father, until the age of 7, was only dressed in blue and white. So such was the depth of her faith. And when I asked Mumtaz about it many years later, I said, because I knew that he had deep faith. He kept all his fasts in Ramadan. He had been on Hajj several times. He began every morning reading from the Quran. And I said, was it not difficult that your wife didn't share your faith? And he said, not at all. I understood her and she understood me. We were both people of deep faith. Faith was central to our lives. She had her faith and I had mine. And sure enough, he would drive her to Mass. He would sometimes attend Mass. He would certainly attend Mass at important moments like Christmas and Easter, but often he would just drive her there. And she had been with him on Hajj several times because they lived in Saudi Arabia, where he worked for the World Health Organization, so he had easy access to go on the pilgrimage. And while non-Muslims are technically not allowed, I think no one realized that she wasn't a Muslim, and so she is probably one of the few non-Muslims who has been on Hajj multiple times, because essentially her attitude to marriage and life was, I will go where you go.
That's great. If you don't mind, I'd just like to ask you about your relationship to the book, because in that recent interview with Vogue, you said, writing this put my head in a different place. And I just was intrigued by how engaging with this family history for you has situated your perspective on work and the world.
Yes, I think this was the kind of project, when I began it, I thought it would be not easy, but I thought I would write about my family, and it was relatively contained somehow. I knew these people, I would find out, I sort of thought it was going to be a relatively contained project. And then it became bigger and bigger and more complicated and almost overwhelming at times. And I had to immerse myself in so many different, in so many related tangential threads to it. And so I think I grew as a person through that, and somehow it gave me this space away from, while of course the day job was very all-consuming, and there were mornings when the alarm would go off for the Today programme, and I would wake up and I'd realise that in my sleep I had been in 1920, and I'd been dreaming about Gandhi coming to Aligarh, this university town where my grandmother was born, in the year of her birth, and saying to the student union, I want this university to cut ties with the British because we are not cooperating with the empire, and we need to take a stand here. And the students followed him, and the university faculty were absolutely horrified in a way that probably you can understand in different contexts. So I felt that's where I was, and then the alarm would go off and I would be heading into the Today programme to whatever the news of the day was, and starting to record interviews as early as 4:15 in the morning with American guests. So I felt like, now I look back and I think, I don't know how I managed to keep the day job and put my head in a different place. But the fact that I did, I think, did make me think, what else and what more can I do with my life? And that probably is part of why I made this big decision to leave the BBC and join Bloomberg.
And I imagine the new position with Bloomberg won't allow a lot of time for writing history books. But are there other things that you would like to explore in this format?
There were definitely threads that I would have loved to follow more deeply, and I'm not sure whether this is exactly it. But for example, I touch on this a bit, is the story of the INA, the Indian National Army, which you've written about. It's the force that essentially the Japanese raised as an anti-British legion. And, from prisoner of war camps, some people joining under duress, some people joining because they would get better treatment than as prisoners of war of the Japanese, some people joining because they did think, why are we fighting for the British when we are not free at home? So many reasons. And at one point, I knew that in the British Library where I was working, that the interrogation records of these prisoners were there in the British Library. And one day I called them up, and this extraordinary sort of sheaf of enormous paper, handwritten about this high, appeared, beautifully written in tiny meticulous writing, the interrogation records of every single person, because essentially the army had to sift through and decide who was just following orders, who was small fry, and who had carried out acts for which they needed to be held accountable. And I looked at this sheaf of documents and I thought, you are fascinating, but I can't go there because it's another book. But I still don't know if it's my book, but it's on the fringes of this book, because Auchinleck, who my grandfather worked for, he had to make those decisions, and they were incredibly complicated, because military discipline had to be looked at also in the context of forthcoming freedom of India, and this soon became an issue of patriotism, and that the Indian National Congress and Nehru used politically and rallied around. So right now people keep asking me, it must be great not to work shifts anymore. And of course, yes, there's incredibly liberating not to wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning anymore, but a new project, and I'm incredibly excited about the new interview show that I'll launch later this year. New projects are very all-encompassing, and they demand every ounce of your time. So that is going to be my focus for now, but perhaps in the fullness of time, I hope I have another book in me. I'm just not quite sure what that book is or when I'm going to get to it.
Well, I hope we can we can convince you to keep a foot in history writing and in academia, because you've obviously got very much to offer that too. So I think we are drawing to the point where we could have questions, but first of all I just want to thank Mishal so much for sharing insights about this book. There are copies on sale at the back, and I hope you'd be happy to sign them. And it really is just this lovely combination of the big picture and the big canvas with these beautiful details and insights that couldn't have come from anywhere else. So thank you so much for coming this evening.
Thank you, Yasmin. Thank you, Kellogg, for having me as well.
Thanks.